Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 227, The Power of Ritual. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are here today with one of our favorite friends and guests who is back after an absence of 3 years from the Judaism Unbound podcast, but not from our lives. Our guest today, Casper Kuile, is one of our most resonant people out there who's thinking about a lot of the things that we're thinking about, not necessarily from always a Jewish point of view, but also from a Jewish point of view. So it's always great to talk to Casper about putting our ideas about Judaism in a larger context. So we're really excited to do that today, and in particular to do so while celebrating the publication of his first book, The Power of Ritual. And it talks about a lot of the things that we talk about on Judaism Unbound in that larger context. So we're really excited to get into some of that with Casper. Before we welcome him officially, let me give a few words of introduction. Casper Kuile is among other things, the co-founder of a relatively new organization called the Sacred Design Lab, which describes itself as designers, theologians, practitioners, strategists, and gatherers, animated by joy, inspired by tradition, and motivated by the future. He is a graduate of the Harvard Divinity School, where he, with his colleague Angie Thurston, were creating a set of research publications describing basically a new way to look at what we've been talking about as kind of the way of interfacing with wisdom that has traditionally been the province of religion, and perhaps being able to explore that in a wider way. So famously, their first publication and the name of the project was How We Gather, and there were a number of other publications. If you're interested in that, you can go and listen to our first interview with Casper and Angie, and we're really excited to talk today about your most recent work, The Power of Ritual. I should also add that Casper is one of the, I would say, is probably the certainly most successful podcaster that we have ever hosted on Judaism Unbound. He is the co-host of the Harry Potter and the Sacred Text podcast, which is an awesome podcast. And
it came out right after we had you on the first time. So I guess, so it's clearly us mentioning Harry Potter and the Sacred Text was just
Absolutely.
The launch you needed.
I have you guys to thank.
Casper, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
I'm so glad to be back, guys. Thank you so much for having me. I can recommend starting a podcast, Harry Potter Unbound. I'm sure you'd have a similar meteoric rise.
Casper, I'm really excited that you've written this book, because I think that a lot of what you're talking about in the book and a lot of what you've been talking about is a lot of what we're trying to get at. And I'm hoping that, having worked for probably a couple of years on this book, you actually have discovered some better language than when we tend to stumble over when we're trying to describe some of what we're up to and what we're after. Could you start a little bit by talking about, let's say, the big picture context of what you're trying to write about in this book? And then specifically, I'm interested in what you mean by the word ritual.
Yeah. Oh, well, thanks for that, Dan. I mean, the context is one that you're familiar with intimately, right? The decline of traditional means of organizing religion. So in the Christian landscape, that's even more drastic than the Jewish one. I think, the figure from research done about a decade ago was that 3,500 churches close every year as an estimate. And the experience of COVID, I think, is only going to drive that further. So you're seeing the disaffiliation, especially of younger people, the decline of religious institutions, and at the same time, this increase in the experience of social isolation and loneliness, a sense of disconnection. That isn't just, I think, about social relationships, but it's kind of an alienation from ourselves, from our landscape. So it's really happening on multiple levels. So if you take those two meta trends as the background, what I'm really interested in is how are people finding meaning and connection within that world. And so I look at some of the case studies that we wrote about in How We Gather, and the growth of gratitude journals and tarot cards and moon circles and all of these kind of things. And then I try to link them to religious traditions of old and try and find ways to translate, which you all do so beautifully, to translate those traditions so that they have real relevance and resonance for people who are already doing something today, and this helps them go deeper and further. So the structure of the book is to look at 4 different levels of connection: connection to ourselves, connection to others, connection to the natural world, and then finally connecting to transcendence, which is my initial step to kind of reimagine how we think about prayer, and to help people recognize that actually a lot of what prayer is about, we're already doing, just in a very different way. And the power of ritual, as the title, was not my suggestion. So in some ways, I was like, oh gosh, I've written a book about connection. I've written a book about translating tradition, reimagining religion. But the publishers, in all their wisdom, said, no, really what's at the heart of this book are these different rituals, these different practices. And it's been an incredibly useful word, honestly, at unlocking a way of talking about this stuff that I wouldn't have even thought of, because people are already saying that word out loud. And that's one of the biggest challenges when we talk about the stuff that we get to nerd out over, is like, we think theology, we think spiritual practices. I come up with phrases like with my colleagues, like spiritual confidence. No one is saying those words. So it's really helpful to start with, the power of ritual, which is something people really feel like they already know, at least a little bit.
I'd love to stick with power for a second. I'm always in math zone. People are sometimes surprised by that, sometimes not, but I'm like very much a numbers guy. Yeah. And power is like an actual physics term. Yeah. And I think it is a very important, like we should break it down, because I think that what it means in physics is actually deeply applicable to what good rituals do, to what powerful rituals do. Say more about
that, Lex. That's really interesting.
So power in physics is, this is the Google definition, but basically it is the amount of energy transferred or converted per unit time. Yes. So it's energy per time, basically, which whenever I experience something that I would call powerful, if it's a ritual, whether it's a prayer service, whether it's a text study, whether it's a sporting event, and all of those, by the way, I see as sacred. Yeah. I think it's because a great deal of energy has been sort of imparted to me, or I've helped to impart to others in a short period of time. So what have you found makes for powerful rituals? So the power of ritual is a claim that rituals are powerful or can be powerful. Right. When are they more? When are they more powerful? When do we get more of that energy per unit time transmitted to and from us?
Well, 100%, first of all, just affirming the question. And I think one of the important ways to distinguish a habit from a ritual, just for the context, is, because there's many things that we do habitually, and sometimes we use that word even ritually to mean habitually. So brushing your teeth, getting in and out of the car, whatever it is. But a ritual is really about something that isn't related to its practicality. And I think that's also where the power is nascent, right? So it's not about actually fulfilling a task that you want to fulfill on a very practical level, but it's about conveying meaning, or a way of communicating a moral emotion, something like gratitude or empathy, or and what makes something more powerful, and this is where the power bit comes from, I think, is when we're not making it up for the first time, right? It's not, hey, I'm just designing something ex nihilo, but it's taking something that already is in our cultural language, right? It's in a heritage somehow, and we're kind of purposefully taking little pieces of that still resonate, or that can resonate today, and applying them in a new context. This is one of the challenges I have with the humanist movement, not on an ethical level in any way. I'm totally there. And of course, for many people, there's deep religious trauma. And so this is a way that they can express their ethics and meaning-making desires safely. But if you look at kind of like a humanist map of time, it's like January is joy, and like February is compassion, and March, it's just like, okay, fine. But like, who says so? And it's so much more rich. And I think it's like having a mother tongue, right? If you're bilingual, like I grew up speaking Dutch, poetry for me in Dutch has like direct access to my heart in a way that my English brain is more like a rational, professional language. And I think that's what this power piece is about, is that it's like, it's really touching like the third rail, which religion is in so many ways, and directing it towards ways that help us flourish as human beings.
So can you make a distinction maybe, or do you see a distinction between ritual, and we don't have to use that word if that was the publisher, but, a lot of times I'll write an article and someone's like, why did you write that headline? I'm like, I didn't write the headline. But how do you distinguish between ritual, for example, and tradition, or are we getting at the same concept? Because one of the interviews that we had that was fascinating after we interviewed you a few years ago was with Ari Kelman, and he was talking about some research that he did with Tobin Belzer, where it was more like it wasn't a survey that people were filling out; it was interviews, and they found that the word tradition came up frequently and positively, and that must not have meant what, let's say, a religious person thinks when they say tradition, because these people were not doing any of those things.
Correct.
But they liked the idea of tradition, and so I'm trying to get at what is it that people are tapping into?
It gets at the heart of why I wanted to have these 4 chapters of different experiences of connection, because so often we think about belonging, connection as really just being about my relationship to you, right? Like a social, if you think of kind of like a horizontal relationship. And I think why that word tradition is so powerful, and what even the word ritual conjures is some sense of connection through time, right? A connection through story, a connection to myth, a connection to peoplehood, ancestors. And so it inherently both elevates and deepens my life, right? Because it puts it in a context that is more than just the time span of my individual life. And so again, like listening to the words people use, tradition is a good one, right? Like we talk about family traditions. There might be college traditions, or even just like getting groups of friends together. Maybe you go away every year. I've heard of so many examples of this, of groups of friends. Maybe they make a New Year's trip together, or people get together for the start of the baseball season and they play, fantasy baseball throughout the year to stay connected, right? Like that there's these kind of things that we do where it's like, oh, it's this time of year, so it's time to do this thing. And that helps us feel at home. Now, you and I would use that language of like a liturgical calendar, but most people are happy to use the word tradition or ritual to kind of describe what that means. And I think that's honestly at a kind of a design level, if we think about if you're leading a congregation or you're thinking about the future of religion, one of the big challenges that we have today is that there isn't really any sort of connective tissue between those traditions, right? People might have rituals or traditions with a group of friends or with family or with extended family, but no longer do we have that kind of meaning-making system at a holistic level, like a religion used to do for many of us. And that's one of the things that's often missing. So I think that's why we hold on so deeply, especially to individual ones, because their importance just rises as so much else falls away.
Yeah, so I really want to sit with this because I quote you a lot. I quote Casper and Angie a lot, and when I'm talking about a lot of things, because what I find is there's a response that a lot of people have when I quote you, and when I say, like, there's these folks writing about how CrossFit and Soul Cycle and all of these different projects, the dinner project, are all religious in some senses, or spiritual, or we could pick the language, but like they all touch deep meaning making muscles. And I think the first time I say these things to people, there's like a chuckle, right? Like there's like a laugh.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking about, I was just in a class from Sarah Bunin-Benor. She was talking about linguistics, and she was talking about how people who, when they're learning new languages, the first time that they learn a new word, they sort of use it with emphasis, and it's like, I like know this word and I'm using it with you. And then over time, they just use it sort of normally. And so what I love is when I say to somebody, like, sports, for me, our sports fandom is religious, or CrossFit is religious. The first time it's like, hilarious. And then by the end of the conversation, we're just sort of doing that, and it's like there's no chuckles anymore. And so I want to get at that initial response, because I think there is something built into us, and I'm going to quote you now, where we think there's this sense of the sacred, like capital S, and the profane. And you talk about Durkheim in your book, if we want to go to the theory of this. It doesn't matter that it comes from Durkheim, but we have this sense that there are things that are sacred. Right. And there are other things that are, like, in quotes, normal or profane or regular. And when you tell people CrossFit or Soul Cycle or sports fandom could be religious, I think people feel this initial button push where it's like, wait, you're telling me that the religious stuff is
Yes.
profane. Like
Yes.
you're equating two things that are part of different realms of life. And it's like disrespectful to say that religion is comparable to some profane thing like sports. But what I actually think you're doing, and why I see you and Angie as like some of my Rebbies, is that like you're doing the opposite. You're saying that which we already do, the normal, quote unquote, the regular, the profane, is actually quite sacred. And so I'd love to hear from you a little more about what you're doing there and what you're not doing, because I think for some people it might take another push or two to really convey like, no, we're not saying religious ritual is unimportant. Quite the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, wow. Let's just go on a long vacation and talk about this every day, because that's all I want to do.
Well, let's actually do that.
Seriously, let's go camping. Post-COVID.
A pilgrimage.
100%. Okay,
Right.
We're going to make this happen. So let me first of all affirm that reaction. You know, I've talked about this in front of many, many people now over the last 5-6 years. And that reaction is exactly right. There's a sense of like, oh, that's cute. Like, oh, interesting. But the more we talk about what actually happens in these communities, right? The way that people look after each other, the way that they memorialize people who have died, the way in which they celebrate moments together, the shared, dietary rules that exist, the shared language that emerges, a theological concept of goodness. All of that is happening in these communities. The texts they study, right? To use Harry Potter as an example, once you start kind of making those real exact mirror kind of parallel images clear, there's more and more of a sense of like, wow, okay, this is really real and that's interesting. But there's still a discomfort of like, can we really say that this is religious? Does that really count? And what this touches on in my analysis is a little bit of kind of a Christian hegemonic understanding of what makes religion, because so much, and really a Protestant understanding of what makes religion, because so much in America of our paradigm of what religion is about belief. Really, it comes down to that question of, do you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior? Right, that's the mark. And sure, we can adapt that for Muslims and we can adapt that for Jews, but like, really, this is how we understand religion. When, I mean, hello, we know so many people who say like, yeah, I'm not religious, but I'm Jewish. So already you can see the category confusion that exists. Because for the majority world, religion is really enacted by what you do, not what you believe. And that's, again, why rituals are so powerful. So when you start to look at what people are doing, then you look at these communities and you say, yeah, they're having funerals and weddings. Yeah, they're getting together for potlucks every Friday. Yeah, they're doing the things that you would expect to see in a congregation. The reason why I'm passionate about this is because what I care about ultimately is that people have communities of courage, commitment, love, belonging. Like that's my hunger in life, right? And what I care about. And honestly, there are so many congregations, sadly, where you don't really see much of the sacred at all, right?
Right,
so
right.
so we might look, and that's no shade on congregational life, but it is to say that the live spark of what makes us feel fully human is sometimes much more present in one of these modern fitness communities or arts communities or justice communities than it is in a traditional religious space. And what I'm looking for is not the outer form that we can recognize, but that inner kind of life-giving spark that really feels like, a deep experience of spirituality. And so when you start looking for that, it shows up in all of these unexpected places. One of the best ways that I learned to think differently about this was from Paul Tillich, who was a Protestant theologian of the 20th century, who really tried to illustrate, not to look for the sacred, again, on that horizontal plane, right? This is the supermarket, it's secular. This is the church, it's sacred. But to think about it in a vertical line, right? At levels of depth. How much depth am I experiencing? How connected do I feel to source? And again, right? You can feel a real moment of intimacy with the checkout person, and you can feel a real kind of drab sense of nothing, right? even in a supposedly holy place.
Well, it's interesting because I think that as I'm hearing you talk, it's giving me a layer to understand both my uncomfortableness with what Lex often says about sports being like religion, but also I think where there's something that I hadn't put my finger on and that I'm actually more in favor of what Lex says now, which is that,
nice.
but actually, and I'll say it in a kind of extreme way, but which I don't quite mean, but in a way, the way in which sports is like religion has more to do, at least at first glance, with the things that I don't like about religion. in the sense that what I am aspiring toward about religion is ethics.
Yes.
And by which I mean the way in which we take on responsibilities for how we live in the world, how we treat the world, right? Which I like, do you get that from sports? Are we going to recycle more because we're a Yankees fan? I don't, that you can answer that. I mean, I'm not saying that the answer is simple. I'm saying that's my initial lens is like, well, does that have that? And that's what I'm looking for. That's what I want. Now, it's not only about how I treat the world. It's also about how I treat myself and how I treat my family and others. And that's why I'm attracted. I'm okay with the idea of SoulCycle, right? The way that, or CrossFit, the way that you've described it in the past, because those are creating communities of at least mutual care. Maybe they're not sending them out in the world to take care of the world better, to recycle, to not set forest fires, whatever. Maybe they are, but at least that. And so that I'm very positive about. And but I guess what I'm trying to sort out is trying to understand, like, can we separate out the various parts of traditional religion? One of which is like to create a club and to create now there are benefits 100%. To that, like mutual care, but there are also a lot of really negative parts of that, which are just like there's no meaning to it, and we're just Jews because we're Jews, and we don't care about non-Jews. I don't like that.
Right, 100%. So the first thing is to say, what I'm describing here is not necessarily something I want. It is something that's happening. Uh-huh. So I don't want to say that it's perfect or that it's what we should be striving towards. I think absolutely there are things that are either incomplete or lacking at all. And honestly, that connection to transcendence is often the least spoken or the least clearly demarked in these new communities, because they honestly don't think of themselves as religious, right? So it's not even a question that they're conceiving, even if it's happening. So we'll touch on that in a moment. But the first thing is to say that absolutely, that sense of ethical formation of becoming the kind of people that we want to be in the world, that we stand for justice and that we give to charity, and all of the things that data demonstrates people who are members of religious congregations do more than people who are not. It's there, but not as well developed. Nearly always it happens because someone in the community experiences something and they need help with it, let's say a cancer diagnosis. And then a community will recognize a need and kind of rally around it. So I'm a very big fan of Leeds United Football Club. We are top of the tier in the second league in the English divisions. And
I have a Leeds United jersey.
Oh, which
it's
player?
Somewhere deep in my closet. No, it's from like 20 years ago. My mom got it for me when she went to England when I was like 10. But luckily she got it
honestly,
big.
Those were the glory years, because that's when I started supporting Leeds. I was at a boys' boarding school and quickly realized it. I needed a team to survive socially, and there was an interview with the manager at the time who had a very sexy Irish accent. I was like, okay, I'm in with Leeds. So, but here we are, 20 years later. But seeing that community up close, and of course there's concentric circles of how engaged people are as a fan, right? But the people at the heart of it, they're raising money, they're doing sponsored walks, they're telling stories, lifting up people who have done good stuff for the community. There is a lot of that happening, but it's more accidental than at the center of the community, 100%. And I think that the broader point here is to say that we shouldn't look at an individual fan club as a complete replacement of congregations. We've talked together many times about this idea of unbundling. So one congregation of the past doing many different things: moral education, social connection, a sense of transcendence through music, daycare for kids for half a Sunday or Saturday or Friday, whatever it is, marking moments through time. What we've all looked at together is seeing how each of those purposes, each of those jobs has become unbundled and is fulfilled by different communities. So maybe what we get right from being at the sports stadium on a Saturday together is only 2 or 3 of the jobs of what a congregation used to do. And people are getting more of their sense of ethical guidance from a TED Talk or from their favorite self-help author or, somewhere else. So it's incomplete, but it is real.
I think it would be great if just for a second you could flesh out some of the theoretical points that are coming up with just some concrete examples, with some chances for folks to soak in, there is a thing I do in my life that I've never called a ritual,
Right.
but like, I do that every day, don't I? Or I do that every month, don't I? Like, what's the deal there? Like, can you help us just with, whether it's people you've talked to, interviewed, or your own, like, what are some just everyday rituals that we might not be noticing as sacred moments?
This is really what I hope the book does, Lex, is that readers will be able to look at their own life and say, gosh, I hadn't thought about that as a ritual. And the reason why it's important to me that we name that it's a ritual is because then we can give it attention and some shape and some discipline, connection to community maybe, right? We can really elevate it and make it a foundation of our spiritual or our meaning-making lives. So some of the ones for me are really small, but have become really important. I broke both my ankles and double fractured my wrist, and I had a big fall off a pier about 10, 11 years ago. And so every morning, just to be able to walk easily, I have to stretch my ankles. I have to rotate each one 10 times clockwise and 10 times anti-clockwise. Now, I've started, from the moment I started recovering, I've started to do that in the shower in the morning. And so for me, while I'm standing there kind of under the hot water and I'm turning my ankles, I've just started to sing one of my favorite like childhood summer camp songs in Dutch, no surprise. And I mean, all it is, the words are basically what tomorrow shall be, springs from the hope of today, how people treat one another. That's kind of a transliteration. But so I sing that to myself every morning as I'm doing my ankles. And then often I'll add at the end just a little kind of memento mori, right? That practice of reminding yourself of your own impending doom. And I'll say out loud, I might die today. Now that sounds a little macabre, but what it does is it really, it helps my brain switch from a life is happening to me mindset to I get to be alive mindset. And, not every meeting during the day is suddenly going to be magically better. But just as that kind of foundational moment at the beginning of the day, it's a helpful way of setting an intention of how I want to be. So that's a small example. But folks I've spoken to on reflection started to say, gosh, when I have dinner with my fiance, we always do a little fork touch before we start to eat. And it's just this little moment of acknowledgement of we're here together, we're going to have dinner, we're going to be present together. You're not saying those words, but it's a little marker of that moment. Or every night when I put my kids to bed, I snuggle them for a few minutes before I leave the room. And I think what's been meaningful for me is to see when people allow themselves to say, this is a ritual in my life. It means that I can treat it as a sacred moment. And suddenly I'm not approaching that moment of putting the kids to bed, which of course is always fraught, right? With some screaming or not wanting to go. But the moment when I get to snuggle them, I treat it as a sacred practice, that it's not just a task that I have to do, but it's a ritual that I get to participate in. When we start to see those moments as sacred, we start to see our lives as kind of threaded with sacredness.
So if I'm understanding what you're recommending here, there's at least two components to what you've just said. One is to bring intention and awareness to the things that you already do that may have the character of ritual, meaning you do them in a repeated way. Like I'm actually thinking that we have dinner with some close friends every weekend, and when we drink wine, which we're doing mostly to try to, let the week go, yes. But we always clink our glasses before we drink, and it's turned into almost like, not exactly a superstition, but we do it just because we're like, you can't drink unless you've clinked, yes. But there's no kind of deep meaning to it. And I think that if we took one more second to have an intention, that would probably bring that ritual a much more some amount of much more meaning, right? That being thankful for this incredible friendship or something along that line. And the other, if I understood it, was that there are things that maybe we don't do, like your memento mori, right, that we might consider. Are there things that we should introduce into our lives in a kind of ritualized, repeating manner that would help us to live our lives in a different way? So number one, my question is, did I get that right? Number two is, especially about the second, the introducing of new practices, I'm thinking that's where there's a real place for what we might call the translation of religion, right, into our modern language, because I've always thought of religion, and I mean, we might have talked about this, but I want to bounce it off you. I've thought about wisdom traditions as conveying wisdom, and wisdom is the thing that you generally in life can only learn through the school of hard knocks. And if you learn it through the school of hard knocks, you've probably learned it too late, at least to some extent, because you've caused damage by not knowing it. How to be a good parent, for example, is a classic one. And so therefore, it would be better if you somehow were able to receive that wisdom from someone else. But what if you didn't have a great role model as a parent? Ideally, you're part of some cultural system that's passing along that wisdom. And I think that the way that people learn is not so much through, here's the list of things you should do to be a good parent, but more role modeling. Here's practices that you do. You don't necessarily know why you do them, but they work. And so I guess I'm wondering, how do we mine the world of existing rituals and not get kind of put off by the idea that there's a part of this where, let's say, for example, saying grace before the meal, there's a part of it in the tradition which is like, you talk about God or Jesus. Well, I don't want to do that. I don't believe in God. As opposed to saying, is there a way that we could translate that into something that we do believe in and we could retain the power of it?
Absolutely. So the way that I think about kind of the approach of the book is two parts, which is pretty close to what you just said. It's really about affirming and inviting. So affirming what people are already doing, right? The snuggle with the kids, the clinking of the glasses, the spiraling of my ankles in the shower, and then to invite people to kind of build on that sense of lineage or that sense of a practice that has a rich history into what they're already doing. So there's two parts to this answer to some extent. One is for the average person who's not spending their waking daylights thinking about, how do we translate tradition? What people are going to draw on is what's available. Looking around, seeing what people are doing. I think the idea of the tech Sabbath has been around now for a couple of years. It's definitely a sense of a growing interest in how can I, not have this addictive relationship with my phone. What can I learn from Shabbat about how to build boundaries and be not controlled by technology, but in control of technology. So that's a good example, I think, of something that's gone more mainstream. Mindfulness, of course, meditation is now everywhere. And you see it in the corporate boardroom as well as on RuPaul's Drag Race. In the middle of a fight, one of the contestants goes and sits and has a mindful moment, right? That's when it's really gone mainstream. But for people like you and I and people listening to this podcast who think about this stuff really, with great interest, I think our job is to go looking in the tradition and find the things that could really work. So, just an example that I'm in the middle of thinking about right now, and I should say, for folks listening, I didn't grow up with a religious background per se, culturally Christian context. I went to a Waldorf Steiner school, which had a very rich ritual life, but no kind of over belonging to a congregation. We're all counting days right now. The day today we're recording, it's day 55 for me of quarantine, and every day I'm updating the little dashboard on my computer to remind myself of what day it is. Well, hello, counting the Omer, of course, which we're in the middle of the season of right now as we're recording. But in Christian,
just to note for people who don't know, that's 49 days between Passover and the next holiday, which is Shavuot, and traditionally it's counted day by day.
And it has something to do with barley. I'm still learning. But essentially, sure, it was an agricultural practice in its foundation, and it was already translated once by kind of Jewish mystics who found a new way of thinking about counting time. But essentially, here is a resource from tradition that could help people right now. And a friend of ours, Emily Cohen, is doing this wonderful Instagram series where every day she's taking a picture of something in her apartment to pay closer attention to. And so she's building up this kind of not just a journey through time, but also a journey through her physical space, the small apartment in which she's quarantined. And by doing that is bringing this shimmer of joy into her life because she's giving herself a place of giving focused attention. So I think that kind of thing is our job. And honestly, often some of the juiciest things from religious traditions are not the things that we grew up with, but are things that have now kind of been lost in the annals of history because they weren't particularly resonant 2-3 generations ago. But had a life where they really thrived many hundreds of years ago. So we have to kind of become explorers, right, or archaeologists of religious tradition, as long as we have a real sense of relevance and current context in our bones. We will then be able to see, well, that's interesting. How can we think about that differently in this current moment? And I think that's the design job that we have right now.
I really love the archaeologist's frame, and so I like it, and I also want to so we're going on a dig, and we don't know what we're going to find, and oh, cool, there's like a fossil, or there's a and I don't mean fossil as like dinosaur, like old, but like, oh, cool, there's like an artifact. Right. Okay. I just heard a really beautiful invocation of a story that I'm going to try to distill.
Yes.
But Salem Pierce, who's actually, this was in the midst of an Omer thing she's doing. She's connecting the Omer to sports. That's not the point of this. But so she was talking about how the way she likes to do Divrei Torah, the way she likes to give words of Torah is she said there was this boy in a town who was known to have incredible archery skills. And it seemed that whenever he shot his arrows, they were always found right in the middle of these targets. And so this rabbi or some teacher came and wanted to meet this child and asked, like, show me how you shoot your arrows. And so the kid just sort of sets up, shoots a bunch of arrows randomly. They hit a wall, and then he goes up and he paints targets around them. And so it looks like every single one's a bullseye. And I'm not saying that cynically. I think it's a beautiful story, and I think it's what we should do with the archaeology. Yeah. Like, we should know what we're looking for. Yes. Like, we should say, okay, we need a ritual. We need something that meets X need. And you know what? 2,000 years ago, they may have not at all considered that need. Probably they didn't, but we're going to find something that they said that we can use. And we're going to, in effect, draw that target around, that story or that teaching or whatever, from whether it's the Talmud or the Torah or something from another religious tradition or whatever it is.
Right.
To me, that's the process. And I think for some reason, people once again hit this wall where they think that's like invalid.
Right. It's not authentic.
Because the practice must stem from the belief, as opposed to, you know what, we're going to find the belief afterwards because we need this practice.
So now we get to the really juicy bit, because this is a very political question. Because now we have to ask ourselves, who has legitimacy to decide what counts? Right, what's within the realms of Judaism or any other religious tradition, but also what kind of tradition that we're drawing on, right? Because there's many, and I'll know the Christian context better, but there's many theologians, from the 3rd, 4th century, who have all sorts of ideas about God that were later kind of told, by Rome were deemed illegitimate or inauthentic, and yet still super interesting. So there's never one Judaism, right? There's never one Christianity. There's Christianities. And then there's power that decides which Christianity is legitimate and which one isn't. So first of all, just to say inherently, this is a political project, which makes it all the more juicy. The one note of caution I would add to the story, Lex, that you shared, which is a beautiful illustration of this, and I'm grateful for the story. And now I start to get into my own doubts and my own questions, which is when we only place our desires and our needs at the center of where the arrow has gone, I get suspicious, because I ultimately don't trust my own desire all the time. Or at least, some of my desire I know is not trustworthy. I think there is an eternal longing in my heart and soul that is trustworthy. But there are desires that I have that are selfish, right? That I just want to get ahead. I want to be better than people. All of that stuff that's at least in me, and I hope recognizable. And that's not what I want to place at the center of where the arrow lands. So this is, I think, for me, why when we think about ritual, when we think about translating tradition, this is not a solo project, right? We need one another. We need community. We need loving accountability. And I don't just mean of the people who we're here with, you and me, in this conversation, but I think this is also where the wisdom teachers of old help us, because they were doing the same thing, right? And they have given us some boundaries or some places to be careful when we think about how to do this. So that's my only hesitation in this, is that we can't just run in there and say, like, yeah, what I want is inherently good.
Yeah, I mean, I was living in a similar zone as that. It's saying, like, it's because in a way what Lex just described is is the opposite of what I was describing, in the sense of saying I'm looking for ancient wisdom, and I'm looking to try to find a way to translate it into a way that it works for me, and that it could also work for others. And maybe I can very quickly translate in my head, well, God doesn't mean the man in the sky and whatever. And so I can still access this. But I know that many of my friends don't. So I know that therefore my task is to find language. And I don't know how that works with the arrow metaphor. I think there's probably something interesting that we could do there. But I also agree with what Lex is describing, that many of our traditions started in that way, was that some brilliant contemporary, 2,000 years ago, contemporary wise person who may not have been carrying on the wisdom of the ancients, but who may themselves have been extremely wise, did something like that. And, B'nai Lappi and I talk about that all the time in our Talmud podcast that we're doing, our Talmud show, whatever it's called, the Oral Talmud, where we're describing how the basically the ancient rabbis came up with all this new stuff, and then in all kinds of ways claimed that they were finding it in the Torah, and it's obvious to everybody that they weren't. And it must have been obvious to everybody at the time that they weren't, at least anybody who could read. And so what was the game that was going on there? Like, what was actually happening? I want to shift this, though, to the question of, like, well, what might that process look like today? Yeah. Because clearly, I think you and we are in the same position, in that you've been working on this book for some time, and we've been working on our podcast for some time. And I don't know about you, but I never imagined a destruction level event that was going to suddenly accelerate everything that we're talking about into the realm of, like, instead of a process that takes 100 years, it's a process that may take 6 months. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, how we start to think about the mass movement part of this, do you imagine, and maybe this is what the Sacred Design Lab aspires to be, I think to some extent it's what we aspire to build, like almost an artist center where the great artists would come and they would come up with all kinds of new rituals, and then they'd throw them out to the world, and most of them would be terrible, and people would say this doesn't work, but some of them would be genius, and that's one way in which it happens. And maybe another way that we've imagined that it might happen is that, and this is what we've been working on to some extent, at least I have more intensively, some kind of Marie Kondo-like step-by-step process of rebuilding a ritual, one single ritual that could be easy enough that just regular people, not artists, just regular people out there in their lives could say, well, I don't know if I can reinvent like half of Judaism, but I could, try to reinvent a bedtime ritual or whatever, right? And let me go through a step-by-step process. And again, most of that would be crap, but some of it would be really, really great. And so then is there some way to bring all that together in almost like a marketplace, right? Where people could come and say, well, I'm really looking for a bedtime ritual, but I'm not very creative about that kind of thing. And then they have like the 10 ones that have been upvoted, that people are saying these are really meaningful. I don't know, like, do you have ideas about how this could sort of turn into, something really exciting and powerful, and not just everybody's on their own to try to do these things?
Yeah, well, definitely the experience of COVID is accelerating a number of trends that were already true. One of them, as we mentioned, was the kind of decline of at least the physical spaces of gathering in religious communities. Speaking with some colleagues who work for religious denominations in the Christian world, they're expecting, up to a third, especially smaller congregations that were already financially struggling, to close permanently because of this crisis. So that's one trend. Another trend is the rapid deprofessionalization of spiritual religious leadership. The sense that if you're watching Lady Gaga or your friend Simone, singing over Zoom, it's not that different, right? Like there's going to be some professional differences, but it's a massively equalizing force, not in a political sense, but just in the sense of our experience of people's kind of professional capacity to some extent. So I think we're seeing more and more people lead, certain kind of conversations on Instagram Live or prayer services, or you don't have to be ordained to claim authority in this moment. Is the key point. So that's another kind of accelerating question. Now, I too have this dream of some sort of like a Hogwarts of ritual creation, or like some sort of center. Now, honestly, I don't think that's how it's going to happen. I think what's already happening and what is likely to happen is that random stuff is going to pop up in random places and somehow suddenly catch fire. The number of new kind of self-care, spiritual, physical spaces that popped up in the last 2 years, whether it's sound baths, whether it's geometric domes with light shows, whether it's, kind of wellness coaching spaces, like all of those have been popping up. None of them have really kind of broken through yet. And of course, are extra challenged in this moment. But you can just see the organic way in which these things start to pick up. I think what we can do as pattern spotters and as people who are really interested in the big picture is help connect these innovators to one another and try to tell a story in which individual people who are doing cool stuff can recognize their work. If there's anything that our How We Gather paper did 6 years ago, it was to kind of legitimize the experience of community leaders. Because even though they were setting up a fitness or an arts community, they felt like it was deeper than that. And this was maybe the first place that said to them, it is. What you're doing is religious leadership. Sorry to spoil the party, but for a lot of people, it was like super validating. So I think what we can do is to keep telling, right, those stories. And I need to check out this podcast, Dan. I didn't even know about the Oral Talmud, so I'm going to download that straight away. So like what we can do is keep telling these stories in which people can recognize what they're creating or what they're longing for, so that it is legitimized. Because one of the things, and I mentioned this phrase, spiritual confidence, one of the things I think so many of us, especially outside of traditional religious spaces, feel is like, is this legitimate? Like, does this count? Oh, can I really talk about this? Elizabeth Drescher, in her book, where she was kind of looking at the nuns, right? The unaffiliated, none of the above. 50% of people who told their spiritual stories would end the story by saying, or whatever, right? Because we were...
Whatever.
Whatever, right? Like, oh, it was this feeling. I felt oneness. I felt connected, or whatever, because it's just literally we have lost the words in which we can communicate safely and appropriately the meanings, the moments that are most meaningful in our lives. And so my colleague Sue Phillips talks about language as being our first distribution system. So I think, keep telling stories, keep using words that people can recognize their experience in. That will be at least some of the connection that will help stimulate that movement.
Not to be too both and, but both of you are right. And so I'm fascinated in the two parallel ideas that you brought up, with Dan saying sort of Dan didn't use Hogwarts, you called it Hogwarts, but like sort of a central space where like artists and others would come up with these ideas, and just grassroots, bottom up, people will come up with stuff, and some of it will happen.
Totally.
I'm flashing back to a moment that was transformative for me, and I'm not saying this because my co-host is part of the conference I'm about to invoke, but the Cornerstone Conference is an annual conference for that third year staff at summer camps go to, at Jewish summer camps. And I went to this thing, and a thing broke, and I mean that in the good way. Like, I thought that there were these magical songs that my camp just sort of would learn, and then I would meet people from other places and they knew the same songs. And it was like, how? But then I went to this conference and it was like, there is an official song every year at this, and I'm going to use the word that shows where I'm going, at this pilgrimage. Like, to me, there's a hybrid here where, for the most part, people come up with this in their own spaces. So Jewish camps are one micro example, but like everybody can tell you there's random rituals that just arise at summer camps 1 week and then are enshrined as official very quickly. And then, some of them spread. But when you have a pilgrimage, when you have a thing like a Cornerstone Conference that specifically brings those people together to talk about those rituals, that facilitates and accelerates the change, the rituals, so that it's not just random that they happen to go to the next place. It's intentional. And so my thought is we should be creating, whether it's digital or when we can, in-person gatherings for people that are just the random schmoes on the street, coming up with these things that are specifically not the top-down rabbis and others. And I think it could be in the middle. I think we don't need like necessarily one central space, although I'm not convinced that would be bad. But the pilgrimage sites could be another route.
There's a wonderful video, which I encourage everyone to look at if you're interested in this question, from the Bacana Institute, which is now defunct, but it was led by Margaret Wheatley and her colleagues. And in this video, she looks at the four levers for system change. And she looks at the energy economy, so moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and points out these four different roles that are needed for systems to shift. And we've illustrated a couple of them really beautifully. One of them is to be the schmo who starts something new, right? Like to try something that doesn't make sense, that people think is crazy. Start a podcast talking about Harry Potter and how it's a sacred text in your life, right? It does not make sense. And some of them will fail, right? A lot of them, right, new technologies don't always work, but some of them really hit something and grow. So then there's a secondary role, which you've just beautifully illustrated, Lex, which is to connect and shine a light on all of those schmoes who are trying something and have something in common. This is honestly, when we wrote the How We Gather report, one of the things that came through so clearly was how many of those leaders felt like they were alone. And so we started to gather them. We did about 3 or 4 of those large gatherings. And that might be, if I die tomorrow, that's probably the work that I've done that was most impactful, was just introducing people to each other. So big time, that's another one. Here's the third role. And I think we do see this certainly in the Jewish world more than ever, certainly more than in the Christian context, is people who are still within the old system, who have resources and political cover with which they can support the things that are innovating. So that might be literally giving money, giving space, encouraging, starting awards, right? All sorts of ways in which we lift up and support those innovators. And then the final one, which I really suck at, is to be present in the old system and give it hospice. So to help it die with dignity. And I mean, in congregational life, right, you're seeing so many congregations that have to close before they've gone through the real beautiful and difficult process of where do we put the assets? How do we honor the legacy of the people who've given their lives to this community? How do we make sure that the facilities, continue the mission, even if it's not within this community? That work is labor intensive and important, because if we don't do that, a sort of resentful poison just seeps into the new field, and it becomes this nasty sense of competition. And so I think those 4 roles are so applicable to how we think about shifting our religious culture right now. And if that resonates for you as a listener, I invite you to think about what's the role that I can play and really lean into it, because we need all 4.
Yeah, and that we talked about these 10 commandments for reimagining Judaism a while ago.
I loved. I honestly, I share your stuff all the time, and that was one of them. So many people read the newsletter where I shared them. Were like, "This is amazing!" So
great. Well, we'd love to talk about it more. But and what I wanted to just build on what you said is that I actually put what you were calling the hospice piece. I put that first, meaning I think that's the first 5 commandments, and the main reason is because I think that, for all kinds of reasons, but including our own sense of guilt, that if we don't feel like we said goodbye to the old thing in a respectful way, then we actually can't fully bring ourselves to do the creative work that's needed. So at least those of us who came from that system, maybe those who didn't come from within that system don't have that in quite the same way, but I think it's so important, and I think it's so missed, that part of the creative process is the grief for what has to be left behind, which is why I think Marie Kondo is such a powerful system, because she says goodbye to the things that she's giving away. And again,
and thank you.
And
right?
thank you, and also that comes from religion, that comes from Shinto animism. And you could say, Shinto animism, that's ridiculous, I don't believe that at all. But nevertheless, if you do it, it's so powerful. And so I don't need to believe that the object really has a soul in order to be able to feel that power. And so the question is, can we lean into doing things that might have come from a system that we don't believe in, and see if they still have some residual power? And if they do, that doesn't mean we now have to adopt that whole system. It means that we need to find and describe a new way to describe that power. And
this. I mean, again, here we get to politics, because people often ask me, "Hey, you have a tech Sabbath practice. You're not Jewish. Cultural appropriation much?" And honestly, I mean, my 2 answers for that on an initial level are, like, first of all, you learn about the tradition and you have relationships with it. And I feel pretty good about both of those things, with Judaism specifically, less so with others. But the bigger picture is that, like, religions have never traveled through pneumatic tubes on their own, right? They have always been in relationship with one another, contentiously, collaboratively, creatively. And that's true now more than ever in a globalized world where, gender identities are recognized as fluid. cultural, ethnic, racial categories. And honestly, the same is true with religion. You can't stop someone saying, "Oh, I grew up with Catholicism and Hinduism, and hello, I'm both." That's just people's lived experience. And so one of the big challenges for religious institutions is to stop trying to maintain boundaries that don't make sense, because they immediately exclude people, but to find new boundaries to still say, well, this is how you know that we're an us. Which I still think is important. It's just going to be a different boundary.
Well, I know that you have to go, and so I think that this is really a great place to end, because I think that this is another hour conversation that we should have. But I just want to say before we close, I just want to note that your book, The Power of Ritual, is, I believe, being published on June 23rd.
Yes.
And the one thing that I have to say that I am so excited about, and I think anybody who's listened to this podcast should be excited about, is that there's an audiobook and you're the reader.
That's
so
right.
So if you want 8 hours more of this, you can get it in the very next coming days.
Somewhere out there is a young version of a next gen Casper who found the sexy Irish voice
yes.
of the Leeds United guy. To go full circle, there's somebody out there who's going to find that voice of Casper ter Kuile in the audiobook and become transformed forever. So anyway,
we do have
Leeds United just got a lot of new fans.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you so much, Casper.
Well, thank you. I really just so appreciate everything you've been doing with Jewish Live and Judaism Unbound, and I just respect you so much. So thank you for having me here.
All right. And to close out, thanks to all of you who have been watching on the live stream, to those of you listening in the future, on audio, thank you to you too. We're going to close out in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. We really, really deeply appreciate that. There's a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, there are our Facebook pages, Jewish Live, that's one word, or Judaism Unbound. There are our websites, jewishlive.org or judaismunbound.com. There is our Twitter feed, just Judaism Unbound for that one. And last but not least, there are our emails. You can always email us, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you can send our way. And you can do that at jewishlive.org/donate or judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you all so much for listening or for watching, whichever you did today. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound Live.